At the University of Arizona BIO5 Institute, we are focused on tackling complex challenges such as disease, hunger, water and food safety, and other health and environmental issues facing our families, communities, and the world. BIO5 brings together hundreds of multifaceted experts that include world-class scientists, engineers, physicians, and computational researchers in a team science environment designed to creatively solve difficult problems. This approach has resulted in disease prevention strategies, promising new therapies, innovative diagnostics and devices, and improved food crops. Join us each week as we talk about science with researchers, staff, and students from the University of Arizona's BIO5 Institute.
Hello, welcome to another episode of Science Talks, a conversation hosted by the University of Arizona's BIO5 Institute. My name is Dr. Brittany Uhlorn.
And my name is Sean Caden.
When you think of bioscience research, you might envision scientists in long white coats working at a lab bench. But some of the biggest challenges in the sciences are so large that they can't be addressed with pipettes. At the BIO5 Institute, we recognize the power of data science and how this field is able to transcend the boundaries of the bench or the field. Today, we're joined by Dr. Walter Piegorsch, Director of Statistical Research and Education at the BIO5 Institute. He's also a professor of mathematics and public health and a researcher who focuses on data science and informatics for environmental and health risk assessment. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, you're welcome, Brittany. I'm looking forward to this. I'm sure I'm going to have a great time.
We are looking forward to it as well. Well, as I mentioned, much of your research focuses on refining benchmark risk assessment methods, which have traditionally been used to determine the toxic dose of a drug or chemical. So tell us a little bit more about this method and how your research is advancing its utility.
Okay. So this is it's now become a fairly standard technology in risk assessment. Imagine that you've got some sort of adverse outcome. It can be anything you like. I'll go back to the original example way back in the 80s when this was developed of, say, a laboratory animal that might get cancer. And there's some risk, and you can imagine some risk up and down on whether or not that animal gets cancer. If you've also got some metric, say the dose of a carcinogen, that you can connect to that risk, you can ask, well, how much of that dose is acceptable to that animal before its risk becomes unacceptable? So dose goes up, risk goes up. And you might even imagine that we've got a curve in there. There's data, statisticians like me, data scientists, will go in and fit a curve to those data. And then we say, okay, this is the level of risk that's too high. You go above this, it's adverse, it's too high. Below it, it's acceptable. And then you can just kind of come down and say, oh, that must be the dose of the carcinogen that got too high. Past that dose, it means outside at adverse risk. Inside the dose, acceptable. Now I say acceptable, not safe, because it's still a carcinogen. We make trade-offs all the time on risk and benefit, and it's just the nature of our society. So one of the goals of this particular, this kind of methodology is to find numbers like that a risk manager can go and use and say, all right, wait a minute, that's too much benzene coming out of that diesel exhaust. We got to find a way to clean it up because benzene is a known human carcinogen. Or no, this one's going pretty good. The automobile is clean here, clean enough here, and let's move forward with that. Unless, of course, we finally get to all those electric cars they keep telling us about.
Well, that's something hopefully is on the horizon. I do find it interesting that level that you said below this level is acceptable. Translate that into layman's terms. Is that level, I mean, how is that level kind of established? Like above means you're going to die, below means you will die eventually, but you may not die immediately.
Seems like a fine line.
Right.
Yeah. It's usually done by risk analysts, and they say, all right, and each adverse outcome is different. But for cancer, we might say something like a 1 in 1,000 risk, a probability of getting cancer. And that's actually kind of tough because you need a very large data set to get that kind of fine tuning.
That's true.
But in fact, what they do with laboratory animals is they're usually around 1%, 5%, even 10%, just to get us going, get us some numbers we can work with. And then we'll start refining that as we start moving to different species, for example. But if the numbers change on anything, we're probably going to talk about the flood analysis that my colleagues and I did. And for flood analysis, we ran at 10%. But that seemed reasonable. It was certainly, we were able to work with the data and get numbers that seemed solid for our purposes. So it's going to vary back and forth on what the actual outcome that you're studying is.
Okay.
And flood analysis, I find interesting. I was reading something that you wrote or part of about quantifying urban vulnerability.
Yeah.
And immediately when I thought of this and I thought of the flood analysis, I thought of those signs that say, do not enter when flooded. And how many people actually do think, well, I can make it through.
Yeah. That's here in Tucson in particular.
That
right?
is here in Tucson.
Yes.
That's right. They
Zero
have lots
drainage.
of they have all these signs that say do not enter when flooding. So when you think about urban vulnerability, you think about the possibilities of something, flooding. We look forward to the monsoon season. We look forward to all the things that come with, actual rain in the desert, and yet that does probably make us vulnerable, especially when we have, dry season after dry season and then massive flooding, which we haven't seen for a while, but it's still a possibility. Can you talk about
I'm sorry, go ahead. Yeah.
well, as somebody who lives in Tucson, it's like talk about, how your data sets can help us kind of predict when certain things are going to happen, and how vulnerable certain areas are.
Indeed. Now, we did it on a city level, or metropolitan level scale.
Okay.
So the study was with 132 of the largest cities in the United States.
Okay.
And we say 132 cities, it's actually around 600, over 600 counties. I think it's 612. So there's a lot, that's about 20% of all the counties in the United States, but it's still all the solid big metropolitan areas in the 50 states and in DC. DC is included. So I can't really say that this neighborhood in Tucson is going to experience this kind of issue. We don't have data that fine-tuned. But we built what we called a place vulnerability index. This is work with a geographer, Professor Susan Cutter, and a top flight geographer. And she had come up with ideas on how you view vulnerability in a geospatial sense. And so we built this kind of metric, which has essentially three components. There's a social component, we call it SOVI, social vulnerability. There's a built environment component, we call it BEVI, built environment vulnerability. And then our physical hazard vulnerability, we call HAZVI. And floods are in the physical hazard category. So if we see, based on the data, we did a 35-year period that we studied each of these cities, and Tucson is one of them. Do we see excessive damage due to flooding, or just excessive flooding to start? And if so, that kind of bumps a city's vulnerability up on that HAZVI scale, that physical hazard scale. And Tucson's is, just for the record, Tucson's HAZVI vulnerability, not that bad. Yet that flooding and drought are the two big things that get Tucson on the HAZVI scale. And not as seriously as many other cities. We can contrast, Tucson's way down the list on the flood analysis in terms of big vulnerability. The top of the list is New Orleans.
Oh yeah.
Way up there.
Yeah.
And anyone who knows flood analysis, they go, yeah. So it's that sort of thing. And droughts as well, that gets us, and it's getting us more and more these days, admittedly, as climate change is hitting us. But the physical hazards in Tucson, not that tough. And Tucson's actually on the large scale for a bunch of the analysis we've done. We're in the low category. I'm very happy to report.
That's
since
great.
I live here.
So say, unlike Tucson, you predict a specific place has a high hazard ratio, a high hazard ratio. How would you like to see that kind of information then impact maybe the infrastructure or the people in that area to better prepare for a potential, hazard or natural disaster?
Yes, that's a great question. It's been almost a frustration of ours. This is a research team that's included multiple grad students over the years. We've written, I think, the 6th paper is now in press over the last 14 years. So it's a whole bunch of us that have been working on this for a long time. And one of the key messages we've always tried to put forth, it's in every single paper, is that place matters. New Orleans' vulnerability to flooding is way different than Tucson's, is way different than Boise's, is way different than Portland, Maine, say. But if you conglomerate or coalesce all these factors together, you might find certain cities have certain similar vulnerabilities just coming on different scales. Well, then let's identify those cities with kind of high vulnerability and then start digging in. There's always a story. And this is something that statisticians really need to, and I encourage our students to do. There's always a story behind those numbers. Don't just give the number. Actually try to elucidate what that story is behind the number. In fact, if you don't know it, go find out what it is. So am I saying New Orleans is a high vulnerability city because it's got high flooding concerns? Is it a high vulnerability city because it's got built environment concerns? Is it a high vulnerability city because it's got social concerns? Because those are the three components of our single metric. By the way, the short answer, yes, yes, yes. Sorry. A lovely city. I've been there. It's before Katrina, and it's just a beautiful city. But it's just hitting on every cylinder of these vulnerability metrics. It's just, ooh. So that's the kind of bigger picture there. Now, what would we like to see, say, policymakers do with these? Well, take a look at them. We've been saying this for a while now. New Orleans, especially with, say, the flood analysis, on average, New Orleans is below sea level. That's why no one says, oh, wow, flooding in New Orleans, it's not a surprise to anyone. Then fine, how do we learn what kind of you can't affect the hazard environment. That's just what nature does to us, or where we've located ourselves. Peninsulas, islands, that increases your hazard because there's just things that happen in peninsulas and islands. Or are you in Tornado Alley? Okay, so you're in Tornado Alley. You're going to get some of them tornadoes coming through. But what about your built environment? Some interesting measures of built environment are the water supply. How do you get clean water? The electrical grid or the power grid. This is a big one. The ability to exit an area when something's coming or something has hit you and you've got to get out of there.
Yeah.
If you are a peninsula, how are your bridges and tunnels constructed? Or just how your interstates and large roads do the sheriff and police, are they able to turn those things around and get 4 lanes going out and not just 2 very quickly and very efficiently? Are they communicating properly with the antennas and devices they use to communicate? And similarly, are the first responders able to get in to an area that's been hit badly? So that's all built environment. And again, that's something we can affect. And if our built environment score is high for a city, that means, well, they've got some problems. Find out what they are. Can we affect them? We know that there's infrastructure. Infrastructure is the key word, I think, for the built environment component. And there's talk in Congress and in the White House about actually moving on infrastructure, and that's frankly long overdue. And we like to think we can point out where you could do it to have the most bang for your buck. For example, flooding in New Orleans. That's easy, but you get the idea. So.
Well, and I was thinking about when you were talking about every disaster movie I've ever seen, and there's always somebody like you who's saying, it's like, we need to be prepared for this situation. And these are the factors. If these 3 variables kind of come to a head at one point, we're looking at a much bigger disaster than if we had answered some of these questions prior to. So the data kind of feeds into we're trying to be preventative as opposed to reactive, because at the point you get you're being reactionary, the damage is going to be a lot worse.
Yeah, and how much you can go ahead and understand what that is a priori and be proactive is important. By the way, those characters are almost always in white coats and wearing glasses, right? And they're kind of sitting in the corner there,
Right.
and they get asked this, and they say, the sky is falling, and no one believes them.
And no one believes them, and then the sky actually falls.
Yeah,
It's like,
So,
I was thinking about that when you were talking. I was like, I think Paul Giamatti was in a movie or something where he was saying, you know what, if this happens, we're gonna see a catastrophic situation, and everyone's like, it'll be fine.
well, so the most recent paper that came out was in a journal called Significance.
Mhm.
It's one of the most widely read papers in journals in statistics, and which we're kind of proud of, obviously.
Mhm.
And again, it was written to tell more of the story behind this kind of analysis versus just show the numbers. We got numbers too, of course, but what are the stories that's sitting underneath this that inform us of what's going on? And it was pointed out to me by someone who was reading this that when we did two analyses there, we did flood and we did terrorist attack. Because this technology is marvelously fungible. It really can plug and play from animals getting cancer to cities getting floods to cities getting attacked in a terrorist event. We did analysis once of sea kelp off of the California shore, which were in the middle of just getting kind of smacked around by their exposure to heavy metals is very high to industrial pollution. Let me say it carefully and correctly. And well, wait a minute, this is a perfect example. They had a measure of the sea kelp was like how fast certain things grow off the stalk. And if that growth pattern is badly affected, that means the sea kelp, the forest is in trouble. And we were able to do an analysis, straight up analysis of this kind of benchmark risk where, okay, it was nickel. This much nickel in the concentration in the water is going to really badly damage the sea kelp. So again, you can kind of plug and play these things into lots of different areas. And back to my point, so we did this for terrorist attacks. And if you look at that paper, we gave a top 10 list of cities that were most vulnerable to terrorist attack. And Washington, D.C. was the number one on the list. Now, we wrote this in 2020. The paper came out in early February 2021, but it was all done. The analysis had been done completely at the end of 2020. The rest was just the publisher writing it, getting it, the copy edited properly. So someone pointed out to me, wait a minute, if you wrote this in 2020, then on January 5th, what would you have said about the probability of a terrorist attack in Washington, D.C.? And I just said, no, I don't know, about 76%. And on January 6th, they just said, boy, you were right.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's incredible.
And it was pointed out to me, I didn't think this, but hey, wait a minute. Yeah, we were. It's not happy news, but
No.
But it's interesting that we're seeing some of these things kind of actually come to fruition for whatever that's worth.
Right. Yeah, I want to take a step back and kind of talk about how you were saying that these methods and equations can be so adaptable. So where did you find the inspiration to take this traditional method for looking at drug toxicity and applying it to everything from terrorist attacks to floods to effects on sea kelp? Where did you get that idea from?
It was a light bulb moment, bing. I was working with this geographer. We were sitting in a conference room, and this was a grant I was a co-PI on, and it was these 132 cities that we were studying, and we're trying to understand things and visualizing things. Visualization is part of the key for this, by the way, with the geographers. Geographers have a really sweet deal if they choose to take advantage of it, because so much of what they do can be visualized with maps. And when you get these, you can get a map, and there are maps in our paper that you can find if you just go and get your recent copy of Significance magazine. Actually, I looked this up. The University of Arizona Library has a subscription to it. So if you have access through the University of Arizona Library, you can get a PDF. Just log in and look for it. These maps really do visualize what you can see. I can tell you that Washington, D.C. is high vulnerability. I can tell you Tucson is low vulnerability. But now you can get a really good visualization of what's happening throughout the entire United States. And so we were doing that sort of visualization, but before I thought of this risk assessment idea. And I was just watching, look at the maps. We had them up on a little, screen, a little whiteboard with the image. And I thought, holy cow, that city is like a laboratory mouse, right?
Wow.
And the carcinogen is this metric, this vulnerability metric. And that's the kind of beauty of many of these statistical methods that I at least work with. There's a translational nature that's embedded in what those methods can do. A rat is the same as a city, is the same as a sea kelp. You got to fine tune it, of course, but once you recognize that feature in the translational nature of the statistical method, you can start doing all these different things. So this popped in my head, and off we went.
And I feel like that flows nicely into my next question. We are about to celebrate 20 years of impact at the BIO5 Institute. And one of the things that we really pride ourselves on as an institute, and I know you've been around for many of those years, I have been around for many of those years as well, is the collaborative nature of BIO5, being able to work with a lot of different people, being able to, the fact that I'm a business office person conducting a podcast with you, a statistician who's working with a lot of different people, I imagine, in a lot of different arenas. Talk about BIO5 and your experience with BIO5 and what it's meant to you. I like the hat, by the way. Yep.
Yeah, this is an old hat too, right? It's about 15 years old, and still hanging in there too. It's kind of nice, good for it. Yes, I could not do this research alone. I could not just be sitting there on my computer. Actually, you can do it with pencil and paper. It just take a lot longer. Alone, I can kind of think these ideas up, but then I have to ask someone, wait a minute, what is vulnerability in a city? I need a geographer, or I need a social scientist to tell me that. Or what is effect of in a sea kelp? Well, now I need an ecologist or a marine biologist, or even back to the roots. And by the way, I'm still writing papers with my grad students on just the cancer biology stuff too. In fact, Brittany, you and I were talking about that a few weeks ago. We had a wonderful result. One of my grad students here in BIO5 won a national award, a student paper award on this risk stuff, but it was in laboratory animals, the cancer.
Awesome.
So we keep doing all this stuff. It's a lot of fun, and it continues to be exciting to the community. But I can't do it alone. I can't do this cancer research alone without talking to the biologists that work on this, the toxicologists that work on this, pharmacists in some cases, because our College of Pharmacy is where much of our toxicology goes on. And pharmacy is one of the original BIO5, five of the BIO5.
Nice.
For instance, we've got other ideas. We've been working with the former BIO5 director, Fernando Martinez. He's got this beautiful data set, unbelievably well curated, on childhood asthma in southern Arizona. And we've been looking at ways we can take the benchmark risk approach and apply it there. So now a child is the same as a city, is the same as sea kelp. It's again that plug and play. We found it a little harder with the asthma data. And that's another one of the grad students are still working on this. Because humans are tough nuts to crack. Well, I will tell you. But I'm optimistic on that. So that's the kinds of things we do. I can't do it alone. I have to do it with researchers, with collaborators, and BIO5 is one of the hotbeds on this campus of where we collaborate as just fundamental nature of what we do. And it's been true for the 15 years I've been here. Does that answer the question?
That answers the question. I was
definitely.
I was just going to pause for a moment just to let that sink in.
Yeah.
So Brittany, do you have any other questions?
I mean, I know you told us a bit about where you might be going in the future with this research, but I don't know, what does the future hold for you in terms of career, research? What's next?
Well, I have two kind of thrusts I have in my research. One is kind of this precision medicine stuff that our bioinformatics people do, and I work with them on that. And the other is this risk assessment, which has been with me for a long time. I started working on this back in the mid-90s. And it's still generating questions. It's still generating interesting papers that are publishable, even student awards. I have more ideas on what to do with this than I frankly have the time to do. And even with grad students and I barely have the time to do. So we're looking at going back to this asthma data. As I mentioned, that one's going to be tough, but I think we can at least look at it. We're going to keep working on just this kind of standard sort of toxicological assessment in laboratory animals. As I said, there's a paper in press on extending these ideas of urban vulnerability. And for now, that's just kind of encapsulated. But if I can imagine my geographer colleague sending me an email one day saying, what if we changed it to, there's one idea we had, what if we change it to just economic damage? Dollar losses due to a hazardous event. So we've been doing floods themselves, we've been doing terrorist attacks themselves. But what about just raw economic damage as the outcome? So now it becomes an economic analysis. Same cities. Actually, we've got enough data now to do it for all the what is it, 3,000 plus counties in the conterminous US and DC. So that's another thing we're kind of thinking of doing, extending it in that direction, more economic than physical. But I'm always looking at the environmental issues. That's where I come from, and that's where I'm going to keep going. That's what started me on this, and that's what continues to be. That continues to just get me up in the morning and wanted to keep doing this.
Well, when you said it, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, no, go for it.
So when you said economic impact, the pragmatic person within me said that's a way to sell the idea to people. It's like, if you don't come up with a solution to this, you're going to be potentially looking at X dollars worth of damage, and it is a very high probability that could occur. And there are probably a lot of people in a lot of cities that are decision makers that when told that X amount of damage costing taxpayer dollars, and they're going to ask you why you didn't have a solution to this, or why you didn't have a contingency plan, that's a real problem. That's especially when you have people like yourselves who may be bringing certain situations up that there's a high probability that this could occur. Now, for people in places like New Orleans, they know because they've experienced it. And it shouldn't be a tough sell in places like that. But say, I was thinking about a city like Seattle, which has an active volcano that's not that far away from it, and has had earthquakes, and is at sea level. So it's like there's a combined kind of places, and that's a place that I lived for almost a decade and experienced a couple of earthquakes. We never really had flooding there, but you have to have contingency plans. You've got to have, something that is going to be able to communicate. Because at the end of the day, if we're all being pragmatic, we want to come up with a plan that helps us all. And for those people living in those cities, it's really important to have a plan in place prior to disaster occurring.
Yes, and some cities do a really good job of this, by the way, and others don't. Or they got a mixed response. They've got something figured out at the built environment level, but they're not really picking up on the social level. Let me give you by the way, if you'd have told me about Seattle, I would have gone and looked up the numbers. And I can do that if you want, John, but I don't have Seattle's numbers in my head.
I will follow up with you after the podcast for sure.
Yeah. I
will follow up with you after the podcast for sure.
Okay. I will say they're not in the top 10 of anything we've studied. So they're
all right.
Happily, they're a little farther down. That's
good.
The social stuff is the one that also kind of gets me. Let me give you my favorite example. Not favorite because it's good, but favorite because it really, it gets you to understand the story behind the numbers of, say, one of these social vulnerability factors. And that's, what's your percentage of single parent households in a county or in an urban environment or whatever? Because that's actually a very powerful social marker of social vulnerability. If you're a single parent with children, that single parent is probably going to be away from the home a lot. Either they're working because they got to work for get the food in the kids' stomachs, or they're doing whatever errands to just make the household go. And let's say now a flood comes flying in, and that parent was out and they weren't in the home or apartment with their children. and unfortunately, that parent gets taken up by the flood, and it's almost always a woman. So she's going to be in a hospital in a coma somewhere. Who's taking care of the kids?
Mhm.
Right? Because that flood's going to take out that city block in an hour. And what do the kids even have a sense of what they should be doing? So you're going to go from one casualty to 2 or 3 or 4 very quickly just because of a social condition. So it's those sorts of things. How do we also address social inequalities that, when they translate up, when you actually look at the story, become true vulnerabilities to just the city environment, the city situation? And it's that sort of thing that I would love to see us do lots more of intelligently. And yeah, they should be reading those Piegorsch papers.
There you go.
I think that too.
Well, it sounds kind of like a fire drill for these kinds of scenarios, practicing what needs to happen should a scenario like that occur, and getting
Yeah.
that information out there. And I'm
That's
glad that.
Beautiful metaphor. I'd never thought of it that way. But
Well, there you go.
here's the numbers. What's the fire? Actually, again, there are some cities that do this sort of thing pretty effectively. I'm not. I don't want to kind of pound on all cities everywhere in the U.S., but others that aren't quite up to speed on this, and there's some more thinking that needs to go on with those city managers, the risk managers in those cities, and those counties and the states, et cetera.
That's great.
But back to Brittany's question, we'll keep hammering on this.
Yep. Lots of avenues, lots of areas and directions you can go, which is always a great sign with research.
Yeah, precisely. Yeah, and it's kind of fun in that sense. It's this isn't drying up, and neither am I.
Well, we want to thank you, Dr. Piegorsch, for joining us today. This has been a lot of fun. I look forward to reading more of those papers and learning more about urban vulnerability and what I can do to be less vulnerable in certain ways, right? I like to be vulnerable in other ways, but thank you so much for meeting with us and talking with us today. And for more information on the BIO5 Institute, please look at our website. Our website is bio5.org. And from all of us here at the BIO5 Institute, thank you for joining us.
Yeah, and one more thing, Sean, don't drive into washes that are flooded.
There we go. Good advice.
Good advice, especially with monsoon season around the corner.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Piegorsch.
To our audience for tuning in to another episode of Science Talks. Continue the conversation with us next time as we learn more about the science happening at the University of Arizona's BIO5 Institute.